Distinguished youth participants, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending where you are. Welcome to the second day of the Youth Forum on Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. It's a great honor for me to see all of you again. So at the first day of the forum, there were intensive and meaningful discussions among participants. Ms. Mary-Kate, the moderator of the first day of the Youth Forum, will wrap up of the yesterday's meeting. So Ms. Mary-Kate, I will give the floor to you, please.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's great to see you all once again after yesterday's first session, which included engaging presentations from Working Group 1 on the Sustainable Development Goals and Working Group 2 on New and Emerging Technologies. I thank you all for the really interactive discussions we also had following the presentations. For those joining us for the first time on YouTube, I am Mary-Kate Monaghan, the Youth Outreach Consultant with the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, and I had the honour of serving as the moderator for yesterday's initial sessions. Before we begin with Working Group 3's presentation on gender, I will be providing a summary of the first day meeting. To begin the first session of the Youth Forum on Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, a number of distinguished speakers welcomed and thanked the youth participants for their engagement and involvement. His Excellency, Mr. Ham Sang-wook, the Deputy Minister for International and Global Affairs for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea, officially opened the Youth Forum and expressed his deep gratitude to each and every youth participant for joining and sharing their valuable thoughts and insight, and he noted their role as the leaders of tomorrow. He also noted that the Youth Forum on Disarmament and Non-Proliferation formed a translation of the Republic of Korea's continued commitment to furthering youth empowerment, engagement, and education in the disarmament field. He also emphasised that the current complex international security environment made the Youth Forum a timely platform for participants to develop, discuss, and implement their innovative ideas on the positive role of young people in shaping and securing our common future. The High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Mrs. Yumi Nakamitsu, then delivered opening remarks, highlighting the role of young people as key agents of change. Ms. Nakamitsu highlighted the continuous efforts of young people to advance change, amplify diverse perspectives, and contribute to pursuing gender equality as key examples of how youth continue to act as the ultimate force for change. She also provided a few words about the key themes addressed by the youth participants and emphasised their creativity, talent, and engagement as crucial for addressing these pressing issues. Before we began with the working group's presentations, the Secretary-General's Envoy on Youth delivered a congratulatory message to the youth participants. She highlighted the Youth Forum on Disarmament and Non-Proliferation as a valuable and innovative platform for youth to develop and discuss their fresh approaches to secure our common future. She also noted that the role of young people as agents of change has become even more pronounced as we begin the Decade of Action in 2021, which aims to usher in ambitious steps to deliver the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The Secretary-General's Envoy on Youth also noted how increasing youth participation and creating space for young people helps facilitate the conditions for youth to reach and unleash their full potential. For the first session, our presenters, Peter and Theo, outlined Working Group 1's findings using the framework Investing in Youth, Inclusion of Youth, and Trust and Accountability to structure the recommendations put forward. In the Working Group's preamble, they outlined their approach to specifically appeal to the United Nations, member states, and international community to invest, involve, and include youth in discussion forums and participation avenues, which will determine the dialogue of disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control. The first recommendation consisted of investing in a youth-inclusive and youth-led disarmament education through policy-making, schools, and community approaches, including vocationary training and dialogue. The second recommendation was to allocate dedicated resources to establish a youth empowerment fund for individuals and youth organisations. The presenters elaborated further that this youth empowerment fund will be used to help development opportunities linked to youth entrepreneurship, economic, social, and psychosocial assistance to young survivors of armed conflict, wider, more inclusive eligibility criteria for youth organisations to avail existing funding opportunities, and finally, partnerships between young individuals, organisations, and networks. The third recommendation called for the accountability, youth inclusivity, and participation in disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferations, and this consisted of four main pillars. The first, to mainstream youth participation. The second, to incorporate multi-perspectives of youth with diverse identities. The third, to proactively consolidate youth feedback on disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation. And fourth, to develop an integrated regional network of youth advocates and organisations on disarmament. To conclude, our presenters highlighted the linkages between these recommendations and collectively advancing the disarmament agenda and SDGs, contributing to our efforts to establish a safer, more sustainable and peaceful world for all. During the discussion, the working group engaged in questions posed by the plenary on the prioritisation of education within the recommendations, how these SDGs would differ depending on the national states, the potential clash with states' national education curriculums, the ability to review the implementation of these education programmes across the different states and how we can gauge their different progress, the nature of resources that will be provided, and if there were any potential gaps in the available evidence, the type of engagement strategies that will be undertaken as part of the recommendations and how this may change based on audiences, and what happens when disarmament and if disarmament and negotiations of that nature fail. Following the insightful discussions, Masad and Inte were invited to present Working Group 2's findings and recommendations to the wider plenary. The 3Ps approaches, consisting of participation, perspectives and partnerships, were used to highlight the areas focused on within new and emerging technologies and the potential entry points to both involve youth and visualise the linkages with the topics focused on with the other two working groups, SDGs and gender. The subcategories explored included data treatment and AI, autonomous weapon systems and biotechnologies. The presenters highlighted the reliance of data and data sets by emerging technologies and spoke about the need for crowdsourcing and crowd verification of data, which was outlined as an important pathway forward in understanding how to make more robust and equitable data sets. On autonomous weapon systems, the working group's research touched upon the need to define the term and the issue of responsibility. The working group presented the fundamental condition within international humanitarian law, which requires that some person must be held responsible for civilian deaths. In response, the working group highlighted the need for regulation of the deployment of these new technologies. Finally, the presenters outlined the potential threats of biotechnologies, which could be used to create pathogens or diseases and effectively create a bioweapon. The working group's research also touched upon the ability for civilians to utilise these publicly available dual-use research to develop dangerous tools and stresses the prevalence of the issue as potentially increasing as the capacities of labs continue to develop and evolve over time. During the discussion, the working group interacted with participants on the question posed, including how to include and involve global technology cooperations like Google, Facebook, and Amazon in discussions on disarmament, and how this evolving multilateral dynamic may develop in the context of disarmament and emerging technology systems. We also discussed the role youth have in implementing this ethical framework for the use of new and emerging technologies, how to ensure responsible innovation, and how to hold stakeholders accountable. We also discussed the difficulty of keeping up with speed to which the new and emerging technologies are evolving and developing, and how we can address this, including training for all stakeholders to deal with these challenges. We also discussed the difficulty of defining between civilian and military development of autonomous systems and ways to deal with these concerns, and also concerns on the use of emerging technologies by non-state actors or terrorist organisations and ways to prevent this from happening. Finally, we had 2 questions on if traditional systems have been neglected despite becoming more sophisticated because of these emerging new technologies, and if there are lessons from the nuclear and space race during the Cold War to be applied to these debates on approaching the issues related to disarmament and new and emerging technologies. The first day proved an insightful, informative and engaging session, and I thank the presenters, participants and working groups for their active participation and for sharing their perspectives. I very much look forward to hearing the further discussions that will take place today and the presentation from Working Group 3 on gender. I thank you for your attention, and I would like to invite the Secretariat to begin our next session and introduce today's moderators. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary Kate, for a great wrap-up of the first day of discussion. So now we will move to the session 3 regarding gender issues. Firstly, I would like to introduce the moderator of the second day and today's session, session 3 and general discussions. Ms. Yeonjin Kim, Second Secretary of Disarmament and Non-Proliferation Division of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Republic of Korea, will take a part today. So, Ms. Kim, floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, participants. My name is Yeonjin Kim, and I'm a second secretary at the Disarmament and Non-Proliferation division of the ROK Foreign Ministry. It is indeed a great honor and privilege for me to moderate this fascinating forum, and I wish to appreciate UNODA, which made a sincere effort to arrange and organize this forum with cooperation of our own government. Also, I would like to thank all the young participants for discussing these important and timely issues, covering from sustainable development goals, new and emerging technologies, to gender, which are of great importance to current disarmament and non-proliferation issues. Following the first and second sessions, in session 3, we would like to discuss disarmament and gender. As in the previous sessions, we will first hear Working Group 3 presentation to be followed by Q&A and discussions. Please kindly hold on to your questions and comments until the presentation has been met. The presenters of Working Group 3 are Mrs. Man Jianhe from China and Lisa Vickers from the United States. Mrs. Man Jianhe and Lisa Vickers, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. My name is Lisa Vickers, and I'm representing the Gender and Disarmament Working Group today, along with Manjing. Next slide, please. Our research and recommendations focused on topics pertaining to representation in institutions, education and awareness building, as well as gendered impacts of weapons. Next slide, please. I will first be talking to you about our approach to gender, as well as our representation recommendation. Then I will pass it over to Manjing, and she'll talk to you a little bit about our second and third recommendations. Next slide, please. For our first recommendation, we call for the equitable, full, and effective participation and leadership of all genders, particularly those holding diverse intersectional backgrounds and characteristics, at all levels of arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation processes and decision-making. In our recommendation, we offer temporary solutions and encourage long-term cultural shifts. We also aim to move the discourse to include non-binary genders and seek to avoid gender stereotypes. I will cover all these topics in my portion of this presentation. Next slide, please. So when we began our research, we found that gender and women are frequently conflated terms, and we really wanted to move away from this. Therefore, by gender, we refer to the roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that a given society at a given time considers appropriate or as a norm for men and women. Masculine traits are generally seen as more valuable than feminine traits, and it is these relational power dynamics that we seek to improve through our recommendations. Next slide, please. Gender stereotypes are rife within international relations and policy making. This has had the effect of barring women and non-binary persons from engaging fully and equally in arms control and disarmament. The first myth that we came across is of universal motherhood. When women are talked about, they are often grouped into categories of women and children or women and girls, and this solidifies their roles as mothers in security discourse. However, we know that motherhood is not always a trait that makes women vulnerable, and we also see that a sole focus on girls neglects the effects of gender-based violence on boys and men too. Next slide, please. We also saw the myth of women as peacemakers. So dominant narratives suggest that women are more peaceful in their approach to international politics and decision-making and should therefore have greater participation. This fulfills a gender stereotype that women are naturally softer and more empathetic, thereby discounting women's diverse approaches to security. We seek to avoid the perpetuation of these gender stereotypes through our recommendation. Next slide, please. So if women are not all peaceful, then should they be included as disarmament leaders? The answer to that is still a yes. And it's because women and non-binary persons come from a range of diverse experiences that allow them to approach security projects in insightful ways that are different from men, particularly from those who hold traditional security views. It is important for women and non-binary persons to be included with a variety of backgrounds and intersectional characteristics so that we may understand whose interests are being represented and the different axes of power that may make certain groups more vulnerable than others. Next slide, please. Therefore, it is from a rights-based perspective that we see women and non-binary persons as having the right to participate in international arms control and disarmament decision-making. We see that there's a strong precedent for this language and agenda within the UN. For example, the UNSCR 1325 established the need to ensure women's participation in all aspects of conflict resolution and peace building. However, we also recognize that the inclusion has not yet been realized. So, for example, women make up only a third of participants in larger non-proliferation meetings and only about a fifth in smaller forums with fewer than 100 participants. This is even with the UN Secretary General's call in 2020 for member states to adopt and enforce gender quotas to achieve a gender balance at all levels of elected and appointed decision-making positions. Next slide, please. We believe that some of these disparities in representation could be mitigated by delegations setting targets which may look like the following. At the multilateral level, parties to any conference could agree on including gender as a criterion when electing presidents or chairpersons. Also, in one-person delegations, women and non-binary persons could be given priority. States could design specific initiatives aimed at giving women and non-binary persons more speaking roles in negotiations. All of this ultimately together, we believe that when women and non-binary persons, including those with intersecting characteristics, reach a critical mass of presence at every level of negotiations, cultures that may not have valued their voices before will shift. Next slide, please. We also looked at barriers that needed to be eliminated and affirmative actions that should be produced so we could actually realize inclusion. To start with, we looked at women's economic empowerment. Since women tend to shoulder more household responsibilities than men, an unequal division of family tasks can place a heavier burden on them and negatively impact their careers. Therefore, family-friendly arrangements should be instituted, such as keeping meeting times to daytime working hours. Also, member states who do not have universal childcare provisions should provide childcare vouchers to representatives in disarmament initiatives. We also looked at outreach. Studies shows that women experts benefit from support networks, mentoring, and dedicated recruitment initiatives. We therefore call for sponsorship programs to improve women and non-binary persons' participation in international negotiations, as well as funding and commitments to partnerships and mentoring opportunities to encourage women and non-binary persons, particularly youths, to advance their participation in political processes. Next slide, please. We also call for the use of disaggregated gender data, as well as data disaggregated for intersectional characteristics, with indicators expanded to be inclusive of gender nonconforming individuals so that we may understand the gender balance and diversity of delegations and panels. Next slide, please. Lastly, we saw a need for strengthening partnerships with civil society. There is a rich history of women's and feminist organizations and civil society who have advocated successfully for disarmament and non-proliferation. For example, political power from women's groups helped establish an international ban on landmines. The participation of civil society groups, including women's rights organizations, makes a peace agreement 64% less likely to fail, emphasizing the need for their involvement. We recommend that states should monetarily contribute to assisting women's civil society-led initiatives, particularly those led by youth, that focus on peace building and humanitarian action. It should also be ensured that women's civil society are influential in peace processes from the outset, particularly smaller ones representing diverse geographical regions and marginalized groups. Member states should meet with regional women's and feminist civil society networks biannually to provide a space where they may ask questions and provide recommendations. So altogether, all of these things that I talked about are themes that we talked about yesterday as well. So that's really nice to see that we'll have that overlapping dialogue. Next slide, please. Now over to you, Manjing.
Thank you, Lisa. Now let's move to the second recommendation about education and awareness building. Next slide, please. So our recommendation is, we call for the gender responsive disarmament education through the holistic integration of gender perspective into all channels within and outside of the school and university system, and through media and outreach programs. We urge allocation of long-term funding to develop and implement the set of standard indicators to monitor and evaluate efficacy and impacts of gender-responsive disarmament education. Further, we call for the gender-responsive disarmament education to emphasize on its humanitarian cost and impacts. Next slide, please. So, why both formal and informal gender-responsive education are important? First, the formal education sector is the most targeted manner through which a vast majority of youth can be introduced about gender-related disarmament education. So it is important for the current and future citizens to be taught to understand gender-related disarmament by integrating into all formal education system. Second, the achievement of the cohesive societal response and understanding of this issue can only be achieved by mobilizing all stakeholders and including all possible informal ways. So we need to link the gender responsive disarmament education to broader peace, recovery, and socioeconomic development frameworks. Third, outreach programs and media are playing increasingly important role today, especially as the internet penetration is growing and more people have access to internet and various outreach programs. So engaging with the wider public through the outreach programs and media can raise their gender awareness and achieve them, influence their behavior change as well. Next slide, please. So how this can realized? So we recommend three ways. The first is within the school and university system. To achieve that, the gender aspect should be integrated into the preparation of education and curriculum materials at all levels of schooling. Who to teach is also important, we think. It is important to ensure that peace educators have been fully brought into the disarmament process and have a gendered understanding of disarmament by ensuring that they undertake a service training on gender-related peace education topics. Second, in terms of outside of the school and university system, we recommend that the gender perspective should be inserted into the community-based peace and disarmament education. At the same time, gender-focused civil society organization can take a leading role in conducting gender-responsive disarmament education in the form of more participatory training workshops, webinars, and campaigns, etc. Third, in terms of outreach programs and mass media, we recommend that the gender-related disarmament education materials, content, and outreach programs should be available and widely circulated into all media platforms. This include websites and social media, etc. Next slide, please. Yeah. So we also need to monitor and evaluate the impacts of gender-responsive disarmament education. This is because achieving a long-term goal requires a process of constant self-evaluation. Such self-evaluation at set intervals enables us to modify and adjust the model to produce the desired outcome. Next slide, please. So to monitor the impacts, we recommend that states in cooperation with the civil society and a business sector should create and implement a clear list of indicators to monitor the impacts of gender responsive education. At the same time, funding should be put aside for the continual long-term evaluation reporting and monitoring on efficacy of gender peace education. Next slide, please. Now, this is the third and also the last recommendation, which is about gendered impacts of weapons. Next slide. Our recommendation is we call for the recognition of the gendered impacts of all types of weapons and consequently urge them to be structurally integrated as part of any wider analysis that may be undertaken in any disarmament and non-proliferation efforts. Further, we also underline the importance of collecting gender disaggregated data, conducting analysis of gender norms in relation to weapons, ensuring disarmament policymakers receive gender mainstream training and make gender responsive decisions. Next slide, please. So why gender analysis and gender collection are important? This is because we believe that gender analysis and gender data disaggregated data collection is the foundation to make evidence policy evidence the policies, including what I mentioned before, realizing equitable participation and leadership of all genders and ensuring gender-responsive disarmament education implemented in all channels. However, the reality is there's a lack of gender analysis in the field of armed control, disarmament, and non-proliferation, which risks reducing the effectiveness of the policies, programs, and other efforts as well. Next slide, please. So we have existing evidence showing that different weapons actually have different gender impacts. For example, men and boys are more likely to experience immediate consequence of the explosive weapons, which while the effects on women and girls are often long-term and indirect. Another example is men are more likely to own, use, and to be injured by the small arms, while the percentage of women killed by the small arms is disproportionately higher than that of men. Next slide, please. So research also showing that nuclear weapons, chemical and biological weapons have gender impacts as well. Exposed to these mass destruction weapons, women are 2 times more likely to develop solid cancer than men, as well as increases in stillbirth, miscarriages, and birth defects. Some women may not receive the immediate care they need due to their hesitancy because of the prevailing social, gender, and cultural norms. Next slide, please. So to ensure gender disaggregated data is connected and also analyzed, effective methods and tools can be used, including surveys, interviews, focus group discussions, reviews, appealing polls, and benchmarking as well. And what really equally important is that also a very important point we want to flag is gender fluidity should be taken into consideration while we're conducting data collection and data analysis. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the main sources used for your reference. And next slide. Yeah, that's all. Thanks for listening.
Yes, thank you for Working Group 3 for a very insightful and constructive presentation. As Working Group 3 presented, all the 3 points, representation and institution, education, and gendered impacts of weapons are highly relevant to the solution of gender issues on disarmament. Based on this presentation, I would like to open the floor for general comments or questions. For those who wish to intervene, please raise your hands. Yeah, Working Group 2, Jang In-tae, please.
Thank you very much, madam. First of all, thank you very much for that very informative presentation. I definitely feel like I've gotten a better grasp of how exactly gender ties into disarmament and how what sort of measures can be taken to sort of really achieve substantive measures. Now, the first question that I wanted to ask was, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, and I might be reading too far into the lines a bit too much, but anyways, I felt that that in comparison to men and women and those sorts of like binary gender classifications, I felt like there was a lack of mentioning of the members of the LGBTQ committee. And now, since like I mentioned, since I'm not that well educated in gender-based studies, like I might be misinterpreting your presentation, but I just wanted to know, out of pure curiosity, why the LGBTQ community might be getting like less of a focus when it comes to gender roles and disarmament. So yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, In-tae. Please raise your hand, Working Group 3, if you have an answer to this question. Yes, Lisa Vickers from USA, please.
Yep. Hi, great. Thank you so much for your question. So yes, we talked a lot about men versus women, which is kind of how the security discourse is today. And that's what we're critiquing a bit because we want to leave room for gender fluid, non-binary persons. But as you might have noticed, we kept saying throughout our discussion that we want to have intersectional characteristics taken into consideration as well. Yes, so that includes LGBT. That includes LGBT, maybe diverse geographical locations, race, religion in some areas. So, instead of listing the whole, the list of different things that we need to be conscientious of, honestly, for time saving, we said intersectional characteristics quite a bit. And we do really think that LGBT people need to be included more in this dialogue. But we would say that LGBT people fall under women, men, non-binary in all of their diversity. If we're talking about in all of their diversity, we're talking about LGBT people too. And that's why we think that having, working more closely with women's organizations or feminist organizations that do work with LGBT people would be really helpful to move the security discourse forward. Also, we're asking for a lot of gender disaggregated markers to kind of figure out who is being represented. Do we have enough LGBT representatives? What other characteristics do those representatives have, and who are they best serving? So really our whole point is that we need to get diversity into the system to make sure that the system is working for everyone.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Man Jang-ho from Working Group 3, please, I will give the floor.
Sure, I just thank you for your question as well. That is a very important question, definitely. I just want to add on Lisa's point, not only in terms of representation, in terms of education data and gender impacts of weapons. They are all actually should be include the gender minorities, including LGBTQ people. So in the very beginning of our presentation, actually Lisa gave the definition of gender. What is gender? So in when presenting that, we mentioned gender should not be only binary. We should including all intersectional genders. Definitely should that includes LGBTQ people. And second, about education, while conducting the gender disarmament education, we should definitely LGBTQ people should be mentioned or should be inserted into the education materials, and also peace educators, they should have this basic understanding there. And also in terms of gender disaggregated data collection, we also mentioned the gender fluidity is very important. We should not, while collecting data, what is the current practice, we mention either it's male or female. That is what we know, but that is not enough. So we also call for, well, we connect data, the gender minorities and the fluidity should be mentioned if possible for that country, member states to implement. Yeah.
Thank you, Manjang. And next, Working Group 3, Mrs. Guru, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Really good question. And I'm just sort of echoing what my colleagues have said about how we talked a lot about minorities, not just in aspects of LGBTQ, but also race and even aspects like age. Like obviously this is the Youth Forum. We want to have more youth voices included in disarmament and security issues in general. But like Lisa said, a lot of the security discourse is still very traditional, and a lot of the research we did was very binary in terms of men and women, and not a lot of inclusion about LGBTQ. And I think that's actually a good point to raise, is that the people that are doing the research, the people that are doing the discourse are probably not from that minority. And that's why all the research that is coming out, and that's why all the discourse that is coming out is not inclusive of LGBTQ. So I think moving forward, we need to consider that actually the people that are making the laws, are people that are in that conversation are not from that minority, not just women and non-binary people, but also from other minorities like LGBTQ. So really good point to raise. And I think moving forward, that should definitely be included. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to give the floor Mr. Muhammad from Pakistan. Please.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, a really insightful presentation. I really thought I understood like a lot of things that you mentioned. It really showed me like another perspective to this. I think one question or concern that I have with regards to the presentation and the general idea of gender with regards to warfare and conflict is that so we can see that sometimes, for example, in the unilateral invasion of Iraq or the current occupation of West Bank or Gaza, so the country sometimes use the premise of gender and equality as a way to sort of veil certain conflicts. So, for example, during the invasion of Iraq, one of the ideas promoted was the invasion of Iraq would sort of help sort of alleviate the situation for women there. It would make the state more egalitarian. Of course, that doesn't happen because warfare always sort of increases inequality in certain regions. And so again, we can see that this idea of equality and sort of more inclusivity sometimes is co-opted in a way that is destructive. And some states or some institutions might perceive this this sort of fight for equality in a very negative way, and then to them it's sort of just, all right, just have more women in the same positions of power without changing the system. Because I think at the end of the day, an imperialist is going to be an imperialist, whether or not it's a man or a woman or part of a gender minority, right? To the victims of a war, it makes no difference. So how do we make sure that this sort of argumentation and then this idea is not adopted in a destructive manner?
Thank you for more, but it was like a systematic perspective regarding gender issues. So are there any participants who want to answer this question from Working Group 3? Okay, Lisa Vickers, please have yours mentioned, please.
Yeah, hi, thanks. That was a really good question, because that's, if you look at gender security discourse, that is something that comes up. But we do think that a lot of that can be mitigated. And not to say that, maybe the interests of states that are, more colonial in nature, as you said, would change, but we're hopefully able through our recommendations to kind of call them out on that. So for example, I think that part of it, what we're doing is we're calling out the stereotypes of gender. So saying that, oh, brown women in the Middle East need saving, that's a stereotype. And we know that that's, not true. Not in the way that maybe, the US, I'm from the US, but the US, for example, will, justify invading a country. Also, I think that an important part of what we're calling for is working with grassroots organizations. So listening to the people who are actually on the ground in the area, right? So like if you're saying, oh, we're going to invade Iraq, and then, the women's organizations there say, that's actually not going to be good for women here, because, it's no good when we're in a war zone. Like, we think that that dialogue needs to be facilitated. And the more that we can facilitate dialogues like that, we think that that will kind of unveil maybe more bad intentions from states who just kind of want to dominate. The other thing that we would say to that is, yeah, I mean, I guess that's really just the gist of it. I do recognize the issue, but I think that we need to, keep coming back for that. And then also, if we have people who are more diverse in decision making, I think that those conversations will start to change. Because we're not saying just add women, right? Like, we're saying that we need to add a lot of diverse people that may include women. And that's why our calls for gender, we're not saying we're just going to add women and stir. We're saying we want to add women, we want to add non-binary people, we want to add people with different backgrounds. So hopefully that's when you start to have different conversations. I hope that helps.
Thank you for your insightful answer. Mrs. Akansha from the UK, the floor is yours.
Me again, sorry. Thanks again for a really great question. And I agree with what Lisa said. The example used, for example, the invasion of Iraq, that is just perpetuated in sort of a neo-colonial imperialist narrative. It's not just about gender, it's about this white narrative discourse that happens a lot in invasions or conflicts like that. So I think gender is just one part. Actually, it's got a lot to do with geographical, geopolitics and race, etc., and religion. So gender is just one part of it. And I think, so I worked in the subgroup of the gendered impacts of weapon. So it's not just about having women in the conversation and non-binary people in the conversation, but also after these conflicts happen or during these conflicts happen, we need people to analyze the different effects that this will have on different populations. So whether it's the effects on men and boys or whether it's the effect on women, we can't let this, false narrative of oh, we're doing this to save women. And actually, if you look at the analysis, if you look at the research, it has a disproportionate effect on vulnerable minorities such as women and girls and boys. So yeah, I think that would hopefully help with that narrative.
Thank you, Gurung, for your conducive answers. And there are one more participant who want to speak from Working Group 3, Mr. Konstantin, please.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. And I just want to add some thoughts to what my colleagues already said. We have not achieved anything close to gender equity, actually, and that's why we actually do not yet have a lot of concrete examples on macro level we can point out to where we can say here is a place where gender parity directly resulted in better outcomes or something like that. But what we do have though is evidence from the private sector and other industries that shows that better gender diversity and diversity in general results in a better product. In the US, for example, companies whose boards are more gender diverse tend to generate higher returns than those with more homogeneous boards. And in scientific publishing, articles written by more diverse authors groups tend to be cited more than articles written by homogeneous authors. And there have been a lot of social science experiments that help to explain why this might be this way. And they show that when groups of people who are different from one another come together to work on a single project, it doesn't matter if we consider the macro and micro level, they expect to be challenged and to have to explain their thinking because they do not automatically assume that the person sitting across from them shares the same viewpoint. Yeah, and we tend to not do such a good job of this when we're working with a group of people who look and sound and think like us or come from exactly the same background, because we just assume that those people think like us as well. Yeah, and that's not a recipe for innovative or progressive or creative thinking. And I think the thing is here that diversity forces you to do a better job because you have to question your own preconceptions, and that kind of clarity of thinking leads to a better outcome. And exactly the same applies for our today's meeting, for our today's discussion. And this is what we want in the nuclear policy space. And it seems, it seems silly not to take advantage of any tool that could potentially help us to do our jobs better when we are dealing with issues that are as important as the ones that we work on. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you for your answer, Konstantin. There are a lot of questions. So Valentina from Working Group first, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Amazing presentation, very clear, and I believe you analyze gender in disarmament from so many angles. My question is about the risk that some women may face because of their will to participate in disarmament. We know that women's rights and participation vary so much around the world, and that there are some countries and cultures that can be way more aggressive towards women than others. I wonder if you discuss in the group how to tackle and mitigate risk for women who want to participate in disarmament initiatives, but their own culture or context may pose many security risks for them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Valentina, for your good points. So Valentina mentioned how to mitigate risk in discussing this gender issue. So I look for the Working Group 3 participants who want to answer this question. There you are. So, oh yeah, there is Lisa Vickers. Yeah, the floor is yours.
I didn't see anybody else from my group raise their hand. Okay, I just don't want to be talking too much. We did look at that a little bit. Yeah, I mean, that's a huge problem with any kind of like traditionally marginalized group who wants to take part, and it's a big worry. I think a few things we did come across in our research on this. We saw that there's a lot of calls for women who, when they are involved, to have ceasefires. Perhaps that's more of like the humanitarian aid aspect, and I suppose that could be applied across genders as well. The other recommendation that we had seen is making sure that women's organizations are included in dialogues from the outset, and there's hopes that that might change. Obviously cultural norms are very difficult to change in a short period of time, but if you say, like for example, in Northern Ireland, there was 2 warring religions. If they said, oh, it's, we must get both religions at the forefront having these discussions. Well, they should have been saying, well, we really need to make sure we have women in these discussions too, and we need to make sure that we have other minority groups in these discussions. So we're hoping that from having those discussions from the outset, that would help. Obviously, in our recommendations, we ask for funding. I'm sure that that would cover, aid. But yeah, it is, especially in the short term. We're hoping that obviously, as we see a cultural shift in the long term, hopefully they might not be attacked because they're involved, and in different ways, because obviously everybody's attacked in a lot of these situations. Sorry. Anyway, Alicia's just raised her hand too.
Yes, please. Alicia, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Valentina, for that question. That's a really good question. I think definitely it's something that still needs a lot of work, because when we look at our research, we find that over the last 20 to 30 years or so, women's participation in armed conflict has increased. Their ability to participate in discussions it has increased, but it's still sort of a tokenistic kind of inclusion of women in these discussions and in their participation. So you find them being included in armed conflict, but certain measures not being put in place to address their specific needs and the way that they are impacted by armed conflict. So, for example, when it comes to reintegration into society, you find that they tend to be very excluded from those programs because they are not seen as the persons at the forefront with the big heavy machinery. And so they are not seen as in need of these programs of reintegration. And so when they attempt to reintegrate into society, they suffer more and they feel more displaced, and they find it more difficult to now subsume roles of what a woman is expected to subsume in society, that is being a mother, being a caregiver, after having experienced a life in armed conflict. So that is why we basically asked for the focus to be on 3 areas when dealing with women, and that is prevention, protection, and prosecution. Basically, just ensuring that when women do take a step in this direction, they can be confident that the necessary systems are in place for them to properly go through this program in a wholesome way. So it's not just, okay, I'm going to take a step in this direction because they lack women, or I'm a woman and I think that I need to stand up for women. But when I take this step, am I confident that I have the protection that I need? Because really and truly, we can say, okay, we will give you a space at the table. We can say that we will allow 5 women or 40% of this board to consist of women. But if the necessary resources and the necessary programs and institutions are not targeting what women need, and basically what non-male persons need, because disarmament generally, security discourse, reintegration is generally focused on the needs of men. And so switching that dialogue, I think, is what will really allow for other genders to be able to take their seats at this table.
Thank you for insightful answer. There are a lot of questions, but we are running out of time. So I will give the floor to our Arpita from working group first, and then I will give the floor to the rest of working group 3 participants.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on such a powerful presentation and recommendations proposed, which also overlapped, as you said, with some of the discussions which we had as part of the SDG group, and that's very promising, I would say. My question is regarding the central premise of your recommendations, which refers to gender fluidity. The fact that it's not just focusing on women, it's not a include women's and stir approach, the fact that sex aggregated, disaggregated, a gender sensitive approach includes all genders, okay, and different genders, great. My question therefore is two-part. One is, how do you intend to integrate this premise of your recommendations in policy and data analysis in contexts where the society, cultural spaces, in fact, national governments and official policies blatantly criminalize these fluid identities, much less acknowledge them. And of course, this may have implications for your recommendations from gender-sensitive quota, peace education, gender targets for disarmament settings, or media and awareness. So I'm trying to understand how and what would be your strategy or persuasion stand in appealing to these contexts, which already criminalize these gender fluid identities. And part two of that question would be, because your recommendations are coming from this UN mandated forum, and having previously worked with international organizations, I'm trying to understand how will you gain acceptance, if at all, with these recommendations, especially in these contexts, without appearing as this international organization coming in to have a saving grace presence. So these were my two thoughts, and I would be happy to hear from you. Thank you.
So I can thank you for your insightful questions. I can see the Mrs. Mafoko from South Africa. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that really good question. Okay, so that was definitely a topic of conversation that came up with our group. And in fact, our recommendation changed quite a lot to get to this final draft because of those considerations, right? So initially, instead of urging or kind of mandating that member states should, look into quotas and that sort of thing, we recommended rather instead that they perhaps, set their own targets for, looking into gender disaggregated data, as well as also representation of non-binary and intersectional persons, right? And so that definitely is a huge thing that we took into consideration. I think another thing that comes quite strongly through from our group is that we looked at the fact that in order for a society to kind of adopt these sorts of recommendations, it means that also those who are working within peace education also have to be, they also have to buy into the ideas that we're putting forward to them, right? And so one of our recommendations was that, or rather in our research, we spoke to the fact that, peace educators themselves also have to go through, gendered sort of education and training before they themselves can go to within the society, within the community, to speak to those issues. Because, it's only really once you have peace educators buy-in that, it's possible for the education to be what's the word, communicated in a way that will make sense and will be understandable to the community that we're trying to speak to. I hope that makes sense. And then just to the last question that was raised, I think it was by Valentina. So if I remember correctly, your question, had been about representation, right? And so I think it's, or perhaps it wasn't Valentina, my mistake, but I think it's kind of naive almost to believe that women are not at the forefront, or rather that they're not impacted by arms and arms technology. I think it's also a very sort of Eurocentric perspective on war and arms, right? Because in a lot of places where war is taking place, the front line is within the community, right? So just because perhaps from a Western perspective, wars are being fought in other countries, then, that obviously isn't the front line. But within, our developing nations, the front line is the community. And that a lot of the time is made up of women and other kind of intersectional groups. And so, women, I think, are already playing a critical role within arms and within these war situations. And now what we're saying with these recommendations is that it needs to be acknowledged. And I think Alicia spoke a bit to that by speaking about reintegration programs and how women are kind of left out of that, and intersectional groups are kind of looked out of that because traditional IR and traditional discourses around arms and arms technology does not take that into account. So that's my input. Thank you.
Thank you for your insightful input, Mark Foucault. And then Wanjiang He from China, the floor is yours.
Yeah, for the interest of time, I just give a very, very brief answer. So thank you for your question, Arpita. So definitely, this is the reality when you really want to implement this recommendation. We have to face, because different country, they are in a different process, developing process, cultural, societal. So we cannot expect that all the country, okay, now we recommend something, so they will implement at the same level. That is not unrealistic. So what I'm trying to see here is, because this kind of gender disarmament is a structural and also systematic problem. It's about economic disadvantages and also cultural norms. You cannot just change overnight. It takes really time, a long time to achieve that. It's kind of similar like when we call for the LGBTQ people the rights and equal rights as a like kind of binary people, but even for that, we realize in the whole world, it's still a lot of country, the majority of the country haven't achieved that goal yet. So I think it's a long-term process that not only requires we have the top-down approach, the nation, the states will make policies, will empower women to allow them to participating in the decision making process. At the same time, as Zoe mentioned, it is also about a bottom-up approach. We need to include the local community into this, especially women and also the gender minorities or all genders into this process, so that this kind of process progress can be made gradually, so that this vision in different countries can be gradually achieved. Yeah.
Thank you. We run out of time, but I will take a last question and then I will take one answer, and then we will move to the general discussion. In-tae Jang, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, madam. However, seeing that we have a very limited time, and plus seeing the fact that the question that I already wanted to ask was actually quite lengthy, I actually had two other questions that I wanted to ask, but I ultimately wanted to see whether if it was okay to sort of ask my two questions during the general discussions instead of rather right now.
Thank you for your kind understanding. Okay. So if nobody has anything else to add, we can continue to move on to the next session. So In this general discussion session, we will look over some issues and points that we've not dealt with or covered last sessions. You can ask any question which are related to the subject of working group first to third, namely SDGs, new technology, and gender. So I want to divide 3 parts of general discussion by issues. Firstly, we will discuss the SDG issue. If there are any questions regarding SDGs, please feel free to raise your hand.
I don't have the raise hand feature, so can I just, it's not on my Zoom.
Mohammed?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I just had a question in regards to the funding that you guys discussed for the, I believe, the educational campaigns, right? Do you guys believe there should be certain sort of bodies that overlook how exactly the funding is given and who gives the funding? Because, for example, if certain corporations, perhaps, or countries in particular, fund a certain program, then people in the region, for example, Middle East or South Asia, will have a concern that the curriculum is going to be partial to those countries, right? How do we cater to that concern that these countries might have and then the populations might have? And how do we ensure to them that, all right, if someone is funding this, the curriculum is not going to be partial in any way, shape, or form to their beliefs and to someone else's national security concerns? How do we do that?
Thank you for your insightful question. Yes, Mauricio Cotton from Working Group First. The floor is yours.
Thank you. That's a really good question. So the way we kind of thought about it in our group was funding is a two-way street. So on one side, you have the idea of going to the local grassroots levels and funding existing programs and programs that may be born in the future. It's all about kind of reaching those communities and reaching those organizers that are already making an impact and helping them, you know, kind of further that change, further that impact on the ground. And so on that side of it, I'd say that it's quite community-based. So it wouldn't run into the issues you raised. As long as they're well-trained, and we obviously, in a recommendation, we talk about granting the resources. It's not just financial, it's also educational. We need to kind of create one common standard. And then to answer the other side of the funding is the fact that we do think that for some of the other, perhaps more larger programs, the UN Office for Disarmament and some other entities within the UN can have a sort of oversight role and a participatory role in educating young people on disarmament. So obviously, if you go down that avenue, then there would be a sort of body that would be able to kind of more concretely enforce sort of education standard that can then be passed on and ensure that it fits the place where it's being adopted, but it also reaches the goals that we seek to address in our recommendations.
Thank you for your kind answer. And working group first, Max Amanu from Uganda. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. So to add on what my colleague has already said, education is a bit, stretched, so it's not a one-size fit. When you look at what we considered in terms of education, so apart from the already streamlined education system, we are also considered to tap into the new ways of learning, which is like in form of mocks, which can be developed, directly without any influence. So if we have a mock, which is developed to explain the relationship between disarmament and development, which can be circulated actually to the youth population, to be able to understand that link and to be able to be the champions and the ambassadors of this to the local community. That can also be the other aspect of education. So not necessarily focusing on one aspect of education, but also considering to tap into the new ways of learning. And apparently we can also use online forms of learning in form of mocks to be able to circulate the information we want, which actually UNODC actually has a direct influence in, which can get involved into without having anyone to have influence their content go into a different format.
Thank you very much. Arpita from India, working group first. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. No, I just have a additional point because my two colleagues already covered the gist of the answer. In terms of the YEF, our emphasis for this fund is not specific to education only. Of course, it overlaps with the recommendation 1 on disarmament education, true. But beyond that, the whole risk of certain organizations or certain entities having too much say in the content of education was not the intent, because with the YEF, our focus was more on capacity building. And all the points that we have mentioned on how we fund and provide resources is linked to youth entrepreneurship. So again, something that is coming from bottom up in terms of creative employment. We are talking about economic, social, psychosocial support to victims and survivors of armed conflict, young survivors of armed conflict, so that they are capacitated enough that they can make decisions and be supported in that way. And finally, eligibility criteria for existing young organizations which are not having that kind of concrete organizational composition as is required for many funding opportunities. But even then, to acknowledge the work that they're doing, maybe at a smaller scale, but the fact that they need support, financial and otherwise, in order to, again, capacitate them. So the whole objective of YEF was to capacitate and not something that is done in a top-down manner, because that was exactly the counterintuitive element that we wanted to avoid. So I think that clarifies the fact that it's not specifically only education that we were talking about, but broadly on the whole spectrum of capacity building. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alberta, for your creative thinking and answers. Thank you, Working Group First. And I want to move on to the next issue, new technology. We talked about a lot of issues regarding emerging issues, new technology. So I want to take questions from Working Group First and Working Group Third. So if you have any questions regarding new technology, please raise your hands. Right. Okay, Rui from Working Group First, the floor is yours.
I just have a quick question. I didn't actually get to add to it yesterday. I was just wondering about the question of autonomy. I know you touched on autonomous weapon systems, but I was wondering about, in a lot of military circles, they talk about autonomy not just having an impact on weapon systems, but also like maybe non-battlefield uses such as logistics or like battlefield communication systems and information target and management systems for targeting. And I was wondering about and how they could heighten lethality of war. Wondering about like, do you reckon this is like clause 6 covers this, or are you just more focused on the responsibility side of ensuring that states are held accountable when they use lethal autonomous weapons?
Is it possible to repeat the question? Sorry.
Sorry, it's my mic with that. So I was just wondering about the potential, there's AI and lethal autonomous weapon systems. And there's also AI, AI use in the military itself, which is said to heighten lethality and the deadliness of war. And I was wondering if does clause 6 cover this? Where you're more focused on the responsibility side of managing AI in the military.
Okay, thank you for your question. I want to hear from Working Group Second the answers regarding Rui's questions. Are there any answers regarding Rui's autonomous military weapons? Oh, yeah. In Tae-jang from ROK, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, madam. First of all, thank you very much for your question. Yes, of course, that is a very good point, actually. A very a very legitimate concern to have. Of course, autonomous weapon systems or the idea of any sort of artificial intelligence or any type of technology for that matter that would have some sort of autonomy in the battlefield alone would also definitely be a very severe concern. But at the same time, indeed, like technology or AI or autonomous weapons or autonomous technology that isn't used in a wartime setting is definitely also very important and of course should be addressed as well. Now, we've actually briefly discussed this yesterday night, and so we thought that we thought that this could definitely use a bit more clarification, and you will get a much more straightforward answer later when we when our working group introduces our recommendation clauses. But Ms. Jamie Withorn will mention that even if there were specific weapon types or types of like artificial intelligence that wasn't mentioned by our group yesterday during our presentation, it will definitely be considered when interpreting our group's recommendation clauses. So yes, to summarize, yes, that will also be addressed, and we are also wary of that fact as well. And if anyone has any other points from my working group as well that they wish to add, please feel free to do so.
Thank you, Inte. Mr. Muhammad, if you have anything to add, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I think Inte pretty much summed up most of what I was going to say. But I think even when you talk about artificial intelligence, right, the major concern there also turns into this idea of responsibility, right? So suppose you have an engineer or computer scientist who sort of writes the code for the sort of weapon systems, right? Who then do you hold accountable? Is it going to be the person who wrote the code, or is it going to be the military force that sort of utilized that code in a very detrimental manner, right? So because without that sort of thought process or that framework to assess who you hold accountable, your legal systems cannot function. And I mean, everything sort of falls apart. So that's why that's sort of the sort of concern that we had in terms of really diving into the sort of little details about this issue. And as Inte mentioned, right, AI and data treatment, of course, is an essential part of autonomous weapon systems. You can't have one without the other. And in terms of, you know, for autonomous weapon systems, it needs take AI into consideration. And when we talk about AI for autonomous weapon systems, then we refer back to, for example, the working findings of Working Group 3, for example, with regards to gender, right? What if these sort of machines indiscriminately kill individuals on the basis of their gender, their race, their ethnicity, things like that, by using AI? Which is why in one of our first recommendations, we wanted to make sure that data is never harnessed or utilized in a way by companies, corporations, or states in a way that sort of disenfranchises certain people or sort of is used to profile them and you know, can be used then in a very negative way. So that's the sort of thing that we wanted to take into consideration when we're talking about autonomous weapon systems in relation to artificial intelligence. But yeah.
Thank you. In Tae-jang, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, madam. Plus, although this isn't strictly related to artificial intelligence or autonomous weapon systems, mainly harming or possibly even killing civilians, it does briefly touch on the point that I'm going to mention. Does briefly touch on the point of how sort of these well, I guess types of technology can be a sort of threat or could cause potential harm to the civilian population, not even in a wartime setting, but just throughout our everyday lives as well. And the point that I want to bring up actually has a lot to do with the case of Amazon. So Amazon, they gathered a team of scientists to develop an algorithm that could be used. So they gathered a team of scientists to develop an algorithm and an artificial intelligence that could identify top engineers throughout the world who could possibly be recruited to their company. And the machines, they eventually learned to exclude women from the list of candidates. And so Amazon eventually had to scrap the program. Now, what's noteworthy here is that while accountability did not prevent or stop the bias, it made Amazon, the company that made and used that program, responsible for the outcomes of that bias, which was perpetrated by the artificial intelligence or the machinery itself. And I think this definitely implies a very potentially dark outcome that could come forward if these types of technology aren't checked. So yes, that's what I wanted to mention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Inta. Working group first, Max, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you for the opportunity. I wanted to ask about the strategy which the working group 2 has to tap into these categories of people. When you talk about technology and new and emerging, technology, and you are talking to the millennials, like people who are tech savvy, directly they'll be able to understand you faster, and you can easily explain to them how this can impact them and how this can actually relate to disarmament, and then can relate to eventually hold the parties responsible. However, there's a section of population which is not only from here, like from say from Africa, but from across the globe, who even when you talk about technology, they even don't understand what technology is, not to talk about new and emerging technology. So I was wondering that, did you have a discussion about how you can easily enable the, and I don't like to use the word uneducated, but like people who have not got formal education, people who do not actually understand technology, and most of them can be at very old age and from rural areas. How you'll be able to translate this concept to enable them support the cause when they have actually understood that, okay, this is what technology means, basic and way which a lay person can understand to be able to support the cause, that, okay, now from understanding this, now this can be the potential effect of the new and emerging technology across the globe.
Thank you, Max. Your interesting point. Yes, many people who are under educational approach, they have little resources to get access to technology, new technology in terms of. So there is, Jamie from the US, Working Group 2, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Max. That's a fantastic question. I think when it comes down to it, there are 3 main points I'd like to raise with respect to raising awareness about emerging technologies. The first is just general literacy. So when we say like emerging technology literacy, it's essentially explaining to people what these technologies are and what they can do, but more, I think importantly, is what they cannot do. Often I think that part of the danger in conceptualizing risks associated with emerging technologies it falls to overhyping capabilities. So people think that these technologies can do much more than they actually are able to do. And so I think that the first step is doing that literacy building. But in tandem with that, it also becomes an issue of both capacity building as well as tacit knowledge instead of explicit knowledge, right? So I think especially developing states or states with not necessarily as much of a focus on, integrating these emerging technologies in their private and public sectors. I think capacity building is a really important step to first use that, or to set the foundation for further integrating these technologies. And so I think with our recommendations, especially going back to the partnership aspect of things, I think partnership can be a useful way to build capacity. And so when I'm saying capacity, I'm making sure that these people can, one, understand the technology, but also have access to the technology. So in some instances, it might not necessarily be, super fancy hardware. It might just be useful data sets for their specific region or their specific sector of interest. And so I think that often people conflate these emerging technologies with like super new, fancy, expensive systems when that's not necessarily the case, right? It can be multiple different aspects that can be then used to further integrate emerging technologies. And then thirdly, alongside that, I think tacit knowledge is going to be as important as explicit knowledge when we're trying to integrate new and emerging technologies. And so explicit knowledge, again, kind of goes back to that literacy, when you can understand how the technology is working, but really you have to have that tacit knowledge, which is passed down from just expertise in the field and that knowledge building aspect. So again, I think that we can integrate that through partnerships, be that through like non-governmental organizations, international organizations, or just member states and internally. And so I would say that those are the three main aspects of trying to integrate in new and emerging technologies in underrepresented areas. And I think that, again, a lot of that can fall under the larger umbrella of partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie, for your insightful answer. Yes, Mr. Muhammad, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to follow on to the eloquent explanation that Jamie gave. So the sort of thing that I think you need to consider when we talk about, going forward with these plans in less affluent areas, I think the best thing you can do there is citizen science. And by that, I mean, including your normal everyday people, your citizens, right? And with your labs, with your sort of developments, right? Making them part of the process, right? So this one important thing I think we need to consider, we didn't really have a long discussion about this, but it's interesting to note that a lot of languages or a lot of cultures are not really adapted to certain sort of things, right? So for example, if you explain gravity or the constant phenomenon of physics to certain groups of people, right, using Western literature, Western books, right, some people are not going to understand that because they don't relate to the explanations at times given to explain scientific concepts. I hope everyone understands what I'm trying to say here. Sometimes the language is not adapted in a way to suit certain people, and by that I mean it's not culturally competent. So your curriculum is at times not culturally competent for certain people, and that's a hard thing to do. Quite often we see that the world sort of follows a sort of a Western or European sort of standard to teach its individuals science, right? And by doing that, it alienates a large group of people. And by consequence, again, as it follows, a lot of people don't pursue those things as much, or they might not understand it in the same capacity at a younger age, perhaps, as other people would, right? So this is where we have to try and make our curriculums for new and emerging technologies, and then in the conversations around them, more culturally competent and more culturally relevant, rather than sort of trying to push the sort of international narrative for these people. We should focus on local issues, local solutions, and then local conversations to sort of get them in on this first. And then simultaneously, we have to sort of really focus on citizen science by having community labs, community networks where scientists, researchers from around the world are directly engaging with citizens, whether or not they're scientists, researchers, everyday people, whoever they are, right? Just talking to them. As you mentioned, directly talking to millennials is going to go a long way because they're going to be like, oh, wow, this is pretty interesting. I never really might have not thought about this before. Giving them some hands-on experience, as Jamie mentioned, right, goes a long way as well. So these things, again, the best way you do this, and something you're referring back to something that the Working Group 1 mentioned earlier on, you sort of have to empower the local organizations that are already doing this. So following that kind of framework that was talked about in Working Group 1 and 3, you can do these things by empowering the local individuals and by sort of fostering, inclusive communities which have culturally competent curriculum. Yeah.
Thank you, Mohammed, for your diverse perspectives. And I will give the floor to Olamide from Nigeria. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just want to move the conversation a bit slightly towards great power dynamics, especially with regards to emerging technologies. So, as we've seen over time, the deployment of new weapon systems such as hypersonic glide vehicles or directed energy weapon systems, like Lisa pointed out yesterday, have a very destabilizing effect on strategic stability between great powers, but also between regional powers like India and Pakistan. I was wondering if you guys had considered whether or not to include this destabilizing effect of emerging technologies on things like nuclear risk reduction or strategic instability in your working group discussions.
Thank you, Olamide. Is there anyone who want to answer this question from working group second? I think the question was a little bit difficult. Yeah,
No, I raised my
Yeti.
hand.
Sorry, I didn't. First Yeti and then Mohammed. Yeti, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Personally, I don't think we discussed about the destabilizing effect of emerging tech with our working group, although I'm pretty sure that every single individual in our group does acknowledge these facts of all the different emerging tech, including AI, autonomous weapon systems, microwave weapons, hypersonic weapons, whatever you mention it. But I think that it should probably be mentioned in the recommendations or briefly, just as an acknowledgement. But yeah, I think Mohammed can add something more in depth in this.
Thank you, Yeti. Mohammed and then Jamie. Mohammed, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So following on from what Yeti said, I think we didn't really have intense conversations about the destabilizing effect. We did touch slightly upon them. And I think one thing to consider is really understanding why the technological race takes place in the first place, right? Why does it happen? I think if you look at, for example, the Cold War between America and the Soviets, right, or the current war between economic war, perhaps between America and China, you can understand that it's if you're being very reductive, it's born out of this insecurity, right? It's born out of this insecurity that, all right, this other global power that might be doing better than me, and I need to sort of really push my game, up my game. And then that's why just last week, or I think 2 weeks ago, NATO had this sort of discussion where they wanted to counter China's influence in the sort of global hemisphere. And they were like, oh, how do we do that? We have to up our sort of investments in Africa. We have to up our sort of incentives that we give to underdeveloped countries. And then so that's the sort of approach that they take. So for example, using the example of India and Pakistan, both countries have their sort of national security interests guided out of insecurity that the other one is going to be more powerful than. That's why Pakistan developed its nuclear program. That is why India developed its nuclear programs. And that is why Pakistan increases its military budget. And that is why India increases its military budget. And then every single time in those countries, the conversation is always, all right, we need to increase our military budget because we might be attacked by the other guy, right? And so I think every time you have the sort of insecurity is rather what guides our sort of development for new emergent technology in a negative way, right? As you mentioned, the destabilizing effect, we did take that into consideration. Like we understand, like, for example, the dual use potential certain researchers have. But I think, again, that potential, that negative potential is directly guided by the sort of national security interest born out of the insecurity that certain countries have. So I think that's how I would personally phrase that conversation with regards to geopolitical issues and disarmament.
Thank you for your good answer. And then Jamie, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ola, for that question. I think kind of what it boils down to is an issue of escalation, right? So the risk is inherently built into this escalation dynamic associated with the technologies. I think that's often a focus in conversations surrounding emerging technologies. But I would say our working group shifted perspectives a little bit and to focus more so on, combating escalation vis-a-vis confidence building measures. And so again, we go back to our 3P approach, which is both participation and then also, again, partnerships. I mean, I keep hammering that point home. But I think the participation point is also important here, just because I think that by getting those more diverse voices, right? So what we call a crowdsourcing verification or a crowdsourcing data collection approach. And getting and doing that, I think we're going to have more transparency surrounding the technologies, and then also have more input across states and across different sectors. And so by having that, I think we inherently reduce risk associated with potential, destabilizing effects of advancements of technologies, not only because one, there's a greater understanding of what different states have, but also there's a good understanding of how these technologies work and what they can and cannot do. So again, I also want to reiterate that having conversations about these technologies is a way to safeguard against overhyping them, which is then in part lowers the escalation risk. And so I think that that's a really useful aspect to consider when we talk about nuclear risk reduction writ large and emerging technologies.
Thank you, Jamie. We are running out of time, so 10 minutes left. So I will take the Konstantin's question, and then Yeti, and then you can give answer. So Konstantin, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much once again. So I won't say that I have a very specific question, and I know how difficult it is to address all types of modern emerging technologies, and much less categorize them within one presentation. But one element that is often overlooked is, in my opinion, three-dimensional 3D printing. Yeah, and popular press and more serious analysts have speculated that a complete nuclear weapon or gas centrifuge could be built using a 3D printer, detailed and accurate computer drawings, and appropriate materials. So, in order to shorten my question, is, in your opinion, three-dimensional printing a nuclear proliferation tool? And should we control it somehow, or there are certain technical limitations of the technology, so we shouldn't be aware of it? Thank you.
Thank you, Konstantin. Yeti, do you is there any answer that you might add?
Yeah, my answer was for the destabilizing effect, but we can, if there are answers to Konstantin's question, I think we can answer his question first.
Okay. Jamie from the US, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yes, I do think that additive manufacturing is a potential nuclear risk threat, just because, again, it goes back to that question that I talked about yesterday in how do you control technology. So right now we have extensive export control regimes, trade controls, et cetera, on strategic nuclear technology. And 3D printing is an interesting way to kind of circumnavigate those controls. However, I would add that you can't 3D print fissile material. And so even if you can create these like 3D printed module reactors, as we're seeing in some developments, you can't 3D print uranium. And so I think that that's an important aspect to kind of consider, and again, have that limitation in terms of understanding what these technologies can and cannot do. So just to be very brief.
Thank you. In Tae-jang, the floor is yours, but please keep in mind that we are running out of time, so answer briefly, please.
Yes, thank you very much, madam, and I will definitely keep that in mind. So moving on to my answer, honestly, I'm not that well educated on anything related to 3D printers and that kind of stuff, but so from my opinion, I do think that there are very severe limitations to that sort of technology, as Jamie previously mentioned. Now, of course, there were several. I have heard some case reports where a person sort of 3D printed a small type of firearm, basically a gun, and then it fired once, and then the second time he or she fired it, it sort of blew up on itself. So while they might not be able to make nuclear weapons or any sort of like big scale sort of weaponry, they do have a slight threat factor present in them, according to the case report that I mentioned. But ultimately, personally, I don't think they have that much of a serious effect on new technology. And furthermore, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Inte. Mohamed, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm just going to briefly add on because we're running out of time. But I think, Constantine, that's a really good question. But I think more than nuclear weapons is because I think Jamie and Inte mentioned the limitations there. Guerrilla warfare and then general asymmetric warfare is something where you want to focus on the use of 3D printing machines, right? There are even certain countries have very strict regulations about 3D printing machines. Like I know in Pakistan, you can't exactly order one or buy one very easily, and you're going to have a relatively hard time finding one in certain places. Usually it's going to be in institutions. So I think as time goes on, as 3D printing machines get more sophisticated, you are going to eventually find them being used by militant groups and hostile non-state actors to make weapons, as Inte mentioned. It's really contingent upon how well the 3D printing machine can sort of, and efficiently and quickly sort of produce certain weapons and firearms. And again, we have to take into consideration, of course, that these firearms are also, they pose a threat because you can use them once or twice and then they sort of don't work as well, right? So that's the one thing you need to take into consideration. At the moment, I think it's not as big of a threat, but that's not something we can take lightly. 3D printing machines are going to be very sophisticated in the next 5 to 10 years, and they're going to pose a serious threat to sort of unstable regions and for guerrilla warfare.
Thank you, Mohamed. So we are going to a next subject, the gender issue. If you have any questions regarding gender which are not dealt with today, please raise your hands. Okay. Max from Uganda, Working Group First, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, so thank you for the presentation today, Working Group 3, and for the overlapping discussion regarding the education recommendation. My question is that when you talk about education, I need more enlightenment on the how, like which levels or are you targeting this recommendation to? Because I personally got to hear about the word gender when I was at the university, when I was pursuing my undergraduate degree. And apparently, it's generally accepted that as somebody grows older, the ability to change reduces. So if you introduce a concept at a certain age, so they won't be able to change much because of the underlying factors like culture, the social network around them, information they have grown up knowing for that long time cannot just change easily. So I was wondering that in this recommendation, have you thought of a lower level approach, like from say pre-primary, primary, secondary, something like that, or for kids, for people at a very basic level who still have open mind, a concept to uptake this information, and by the time they grow up, I mean, it's already well saturated. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Mofogi Mafoko from South Africa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Max, for that question. You would have seen in our recommendation 2, which dealt with education, that we specifically do say that we would like to target formal education sector, so from school through to tertiary, as well as outreach. So that takes care of people who are not in the formal education sector, as well as media, because we know that in especially places that are underdeveloped or are developing nations, media is a huge form or huge mechanism through which to communicate to a wider audience. So absolutely, definitely, yes. We were very cognizant of all trying to cover our bases rather of all education sectors, both formal and informal. And we definitely do agree that sort of targeted way through which to teach education should be implemented from pre-primary all the way through into tertiary education. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. We are running out of time, but I will take Inte's and Valentina's questions, and then I wrap up the question. So Inte and Valentina, the floor is yours. First, Inte, please.
Thank you very much, madam. So once again, thank you very much for your presentation today. So the question that I previously wanted to ask was, so from my perspective, these gender stereotypes or viewpoints on gender-related issues are often correlated to religion and culture. And so certain religions and cultures have or are associated with a stigma that sort of limit the active participation of non-male genders. And since this is related to the topic of religion and culture, there's often a very fine line that we need to cautiously tread on, which is formed. And so on the one hand, if we move slightly too far, we could anger and possibly offend members of a specific culture or religion. But on the other hand, we might be too cautious to the point where the initiatives that are taken might not bring forth meaningful change. So keeping that in mind, how would religion tie into the recommendations you mentioned? And should we take different approaches according to the religion and or culture, or should we implement a universal action plan? So that was the question that I wanted to ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Inte. Valentina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yes, I just wanted to make a quick question. My question is how to deconstruct this toxic or aggressive war-prone masculinity within disarmament, or how to construct alternative masculinities in the field. A lot of efforts are oriented toward women, empowering women so that they demand inclusion, the rights that they deserve. But I believe that there is little work in general, not in the working group, in general, little work engaging men and having men taking the initiative to address the gender gap. I wonder if you thought to include in the recommendations any strategy on how to engage men to rethink this war-prone masculinity in disarmament. Thank you.
Thank you for the good questions. And are there any people from Working Group 3 to answer these questions?
Could jump in if that's
okay. Manjan from China, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Inte. I want to answer Inte's question regarding religion and culture. So at least my personal position is different country and different society have their uniqueness, including religion and culture and everything, and tradition as well. So we cannot say when we recommend something, we should first, the position is we should respect what country their own religion, their own culture. This is the basic thing, something we have to follow that. And based on that, this is something we recommend, but we cannot say you have to implement this. This is our recommendation there. You can consider, and you should also contextualize the rules or the policies you want to make that can align with and also is accepted by the audience, by the public in your country. So to be very short, you have to respect the local context, culture, religion, and then based on that can localize, contextualize the policies or recommendations. Yeah.
Thank you, participants. It was very heated and passionate discussion. It looks like we've covered all the items for today's meeting. I believe it was the great opportunity for all of us to highlight 3 topics of relevance to young generation and disarmament issues. I wish to thank all the participants for their active contribution in making this fruitful discussion. I will invite the Secretariat to the floor. So, Secretariat, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Kim, for your effort. Now we will move the most important part of the youth from the adoption of Seoul Youth Declaration for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. As a result of consultations within the working groups for a month, and between groups, all participants has made a great recommendation for the final declaration. I really appreciate all of you for the hard works, even though the time constraint, and also appreciate to understand, to agree the declaration. Regarding some different opinions, I hope we can discuss that issue for our next event or other chance. So now I would like to introduce 3 drafting committee members, Mr. Max Emmanuel, and Ms. Jamie Withern, and Ms. Mapogi Mafako. So please introduce each working group's works briefly in a 1 and 2 minutes, and please read the declarative section clearly made by your working groups. So, Mr. Max, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I request for the screen. I can't see the screen for the work.
Okay, so.
Thank you. I can see it now. Yes, so our group is working group 1, which is working on SDGs, which is Sustainable Development Goals. And our role here was to basically look at the role of the youth in getting involved in bringing that connection between Sustainable Development Goals and disarmament, as well as to introduce the concept of that connection, that what is the relationship between disarmament and then Sustainable Development Goals, and then those ones which are directly involved, for example, peace and strong institutions as SDG, and then those other Sustainable Development Goals which are related directly to disarmament. So, and of course, from the deliberation we've had from yesterday up to today, we are in agreement that there is a direct link between sustainable development and then disarmament, which is actually something great. So this is where we are building up from to give our recommendations today. So these are our recommendations. Number 1, we call for acknowledging the fundamental importance of a youth inclusive and youth-led disarmament education at these levels, policy making through evidence-based research with a focus on young people's experience vis-a-vis armed conflict use and use of arms. Schools through compulsory and standardized curriculum on disarmament at pre-tertiary levels, and then community sensitization, vocational training, and dialogue by supporting grassroots youth efforts and young leaders, as well as champions of change. Our recommendation number 2, we call for dedicating adequate resources for young people working on disarmament issues and establish a youth empowerment fund for young individuals and youth organizations that would support in these areas development of opportunities linked to youth entrepreneurship. 2, economic and social cycles assistance for young survivors of armed conflicts. And 3, wider, more inclusive eligibility criteria for organizations to avail themselves of existing funding opportunities. And then 4, partnerships between young individuals, organizations, and networks in form of joint projects studied towards common action plans and response on disarmament issues, with an outlook towards sharing of good practices and diverse experience. And then finally, our recommendation number 3, we encourage to mainstream youth participation through specific youth quota, reflective of member states' internal demographics as an official prerequisite within their delegations on all matters relating to disarmament and non-proliferation, And then 2, incorporate multi-perspective of youth with diverse identity, that is social, cultural, geographic, gender, ethnicity, among others, in discussions with policymakers. And then thirdly, proactively consolidate youth feedback on disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation, particularly from decentralized levels, grassroots advocates, and organizations on disarmament issues that is convened periodically by the relevant UN entities and fosters continued dialogue on, and coordination on topical issues.
Thank you, Max. Oh. Okay, so now, Jamie, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Jamie Withorn, and I will be representing Working Group 2 on New and Emerging Technologies. Yesterday in our presentation, we covered several key points that we think are crucial to consider when discussing new and emerging technologies and disarmament and non-proliferation. It is clear that new and emerging technologies will inevitably change the future of conflict. This will lead to a paradigm shift in how international security is conceptualized. Countries, including United Nations member states, as well as various other non-governmental organizations, international organizations, and other entities must be prepared to address this shift. While our presentation only covered 3 different types of current emerging technologies, we simultaneously presented a flexible framework to address other types of potential future advancements. Notably, this framework can be adapted and can evolve in tandem with various technological developments. In order to begin to address challenges associated with emerging technologies, it is imperative that more people from more diverse backgrounds and geographical areas become involved in emerging technology issues. These new voices, including younger voices, much like our own, are necessary to ensure emerging technologies are not perpetuating bias and are being used in ethical and accountable ways. Similarly, partnerships should be developed to encourage collaboration in the field of emerging technology across countries. Prioritizing collaboration as opposed to competition and subsequent potential conflict is crucial when working towards future disarmament goals. These partnerships can also further research on emerging technologies by encouraging ethical applications and citizens science approaches. So now, without further ado, I present Working Group 2's recommended declarations. First, we call for the integration of an ethical framework that incorporates data verification and data provenance with respect to member states' citizens' personal and private data in order to reduce biases in data processing and respective algorithms and applications, as well as securing data for protection against actors that may choose to use it in a hostile manner. 2, we encourage strict regulations on autonomous weapon systems to prevent proliferation and to ensure that machines do not have the capacity to independently operate in conflicts without significant human participation in terms of authorization and control of their use and deployment. And finally, 3, we support the formation of the central and central role of ethical committees that analyze and assess the general use potential of research, thereby identifying any elements of the research that may in part or in full be used in a hostile manner by states or non-state actors. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. So lastly, Mafoko, I will give the floor to you, please.
Apologies for that. So thank you very much. As the Secretariat has introduced me, I am Mbohi Mafoko from Working Group 3. So I'm just going to quickly speak to the main points of our presentation as was presented today. So basically, we had decided to split our presentation into 3 subcategories, which were education, arms and weapons rather, and weapons technology, as well as representation. A big part of our presentation centered around the conflation of gender and women and why that was problematic and how, we would like to change those narratives, right? And then another big part of our presentation just spoke towards the collection of gender disaggregated data, and then also the need to humanize, discourses around arms and arms technology, so that we move away from rhetorics which speak to these sorts of technologies as deterrents, but rather speak to the humanitarian impact and cost of such technologies. So without further ado, I'd like to just read our recommendations. So we call for the equitable, full, and effective participation and leadership of all genders, particularly those holding diverse intersectional backgrounds and identities at all levels of arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation processes and decision-making. This may be achieved through setting gender targets for disarmament meetings, fully integrating inclusive practices and culture across institutions, the use of quantitative and qualitative standards to track the full and equal participation disaggregated by gender in UN-led disarmament processes, and ensuring the representation of persons or organizations of marginalized groups. Further, we call for avoiding gender stereotypes in the discussions on participation and for consideration of shifting the discourse away from binary genders that risks excluding non-binary persons. We call for gender-responsive disarmament education through holistic integration of gender perspectives into all channels within and outside of the school and university system and through outreach and media. We urge for adequate long-term investment in the monitoring and evaluation of the impacts of gender-responsive disarmament education on the basis of standard indicators. We call for the recognition of the gendered impacts of all types of weapons and weapon technology, and consequently urge them to be structurally incorporated as part of any wider analysis that may be undertaken in arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation efforts. Further, we underline the importance of collecting gender disaggregated data, conducting analysis of gender norms in relation to weapons, and providing disarmament policymakers with gender mainstreaming training to ensure gender responsive decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Falco. Please welcome the final adoption of Seoul Youth Declaration for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation with big applause. Thank you very much, everyone. So now we have reached the conclusion for the last session of the Youth Forum. So I would like to introduce Ms. Mary Soliman first, Chief Regional Disarmament, Information and Outreach Branch, United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. She will deliver our closing remarks in live. So please welcome her with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much and thank you very much and greetings to all. I have to say it gives me great pleasure to address this forum today. It's very interesting discussions, very insightful, and I'm very impressed. I would like to extend first my sincere thanks to the Republic of Korea for their continued strong partnership with the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. It's a partnership we value very much. The Republic of Korea tabled the first ever General Assembly resolution on youth and disarmament, and we look forward to further our joint collaboration for engagement and education and empowering of young people as the leaders of the tomorrow of this world. I also want to thank the Secretariat of the Youth Forum for their hard work and support in facilitating this event. To our youth participants, a huge congratulations. To all of you for the constructive, engaging, and inspiring deliberations that have taken place over these 2 days. I hope that the networks that have been forged through this forum will continue and will provide opportunities to support your efforts for securing our common future. I have listened with great interest and actually was taking notes during the presentations and the discussions that took place during this forum. And 3 words come to mind to me when to sum up what I have actually witnessed. And these words are participation, perspectives, and partnerships. And let me just explain very briefly what I mean. Let's start with the first of the 3 Ps, participation. Your participation in this forum is not just a talk shop. It actually has a tangible and substantive action. You have just adopted the Youth Declaration that came out of this forum. This declaration includes key action-oriented strategies for establishing a safer, more peaceful world for all. I am inspired by the approaches recommended, especially those to increase the participation of all stakeholders. The world belongs to all of us, not just a few, ensuring their crucial involvement and contributions to advance disarmament and non-proliferation objectives. The second P, perspectives. Your perspectives have provided a spark of creativity through the series of recommendations that have been adopted today. As the Secretary General of the United Nations in his Agenda for Disarmament mentioned, he said young people continuously respond to challenges we face with new ways to interact and organizing advanced, bolder solutions when the present generation has lagged behind. Your comments, insight, and recommendations echo these sentiments and demonstrate your role as agents of change with the ability to lead the way for a more peaceful tomorrow. The last of the three Ps is partnership. The collaborative partnerships formed within your working groups and with your fellow participants have been instrumental in the success of this forum. The open, interactive, and respectful discussions held have provided an apt space for all to voice their perspectives, which have been heard, but more importantly, have been integrated in the Seoul Youth Declaration on Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. We at the Office for Disarmament Affairs recognize the importance of working with and for young people to enact change. And this is why we launched the Youth for Disarmament Initiative in 2019. Since then, an array of projects have been initiated, inviting people with diverse skills, interests, and backgrounds to share their insight, knowledge, and passion. But more importantly, to challenge them to produce forward-looking recommendations and ideas for a better world. This includes some activities that I will just mention briefly: the flagship UN Youth Champions for Disarmament training program, the 75 Words for Disarmament Youth Challenge, and the ongoing What If Spestera Youth Video Challenge. And I hope all of you had a chance to peruse our website and familiarize yourself with the work that our youth team in the office has been doing. Each of these projects highlights the office's intention to place youth at the center of disarmament approaches. I am pleased to add the Youth Forum on Disarmament and Non-Proliferation to this list and assure you that we firmly recognize each and every one of you as a valuable partner in our collective journey towards establishing a more sustainable and peaceful world for all. In closing, I again congratulate you all on a successful and inspiring youth forum on disarmament and non-proliferation and wish you the very best for your future endeavors. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Soliman, for your great remarks. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Park Il, Director General for Non-Proliferation and Nuclear Affairs, Minister of Foreign Affairs. He will deliver a closing remarks on site. Please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Distinguished youth participants, let me start with a round of applause to all participants across the globe for having actively contributed to the discussion over the past 2 days. Those in the Americas joined since early morning, whereas it is nearing midnight for our participants in Oceania. One thing is clear. It is that neither the differing time zones nor persistent challenges of COVID-19 can dampen our young people's passion toward bringing a change for the better and the passion toward securing our common future. Of course, 2 short virtual meetings would not have been enough in light of the complexity of the issues at hand. Nevertheless, I believe we have used the given time wisely and had quite a meaningful exchange of views on the role of youth in disarmament and non-proliferation. Above all, your dedicated efforts culminated into the Seoul Youth declaration just adopted. It is the first of its kind in the field of arms control. The declaration embraces the young people's own voice in calling for progress, as well as creative proposals to promote the synergies with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, new and emerging technologies, and gender. It is indeed an achievement that you should be all proud of. For its part, Korea is proud to host this important forum with the UN Office for Disarmament, UNODA, with the belief that the young people are the ultimate force for change. I am confident that together with our young participants, we have laid another stepping stone in creating platform for youth engagement in disarmament and non-proliferation. So I would like to take this opportunity to extend my deepest appreciation to each and every youth participant for engaging in every perceptive and constructive discussions and providing candid and fresh views throughout the session. I would also like to extend my gratitude to the UNODA and its dedicated team for their hard work in organizing this forum. As a champion of Action 38 of the Secretary General's Agenda for Disarmament, Korea will continue to lead in the international efforts to furthering youth empowerment, engagement, and education in disarmament and non-proliferation. We look forward to tabling the second resolution on youth, disarmament, and non-proliferation at the upcoming 76th UN General Assembly this fall. We count on your valuable support in the implementation of this resolution in your respective countries and regions, and of course, globally. With these remarks, I declare the Youth Forum on Disarmament and Non-Proliferation closed. Thank you, and see you all again.
Thank you very much. This concludes the Youth Forum on Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. Thank you for all for your constructive presentation and discussion via not only the on-site here, but also online. The Republic of Korea and the United Nations will put our efforts to provide platform for youth engagement continuously. So I'm looking forward to seeing every one of you again in another event for youth engagement. Finally, we will send certificate with Mr. Park and Ms. Soliman's signature to every participant with the final declaration. So this is the end of the Youth Forum. Thank you very much, everyone.